Thank you so much for joining us. As a matter of context, I'll introduce myself. My name is Dennis Omumbwa. I'm that guy of corporate governance programs and board programs at Strathmore Business School within the Executive Education Department. And I have the distinct pleasure of speaking with Father Martin Mundia, who we all know, hopefully, and who is the university chaplain, a big hat to wear, and would be quite interested to know who Father Martin is. Where were you born, Father Martin? What did your journey look like, if I may ask?
Thank you very much, Dennis. I'm also happy to be with you. And to our listeners, I thank you for tuning in. And to your question, I was born in Nakuru County, in a place called, actually I can't even tell you the hospital now that I checked my birth certificate. It's called Nakuru Annex Hospital, which is now, there's a lot of fighting going on between the county government, I think, and the national government. Anyway, but that's neither here nor there. So that's where I was born. And then, of course, I was brought up there. I was brought up in a place called Koinange. And then we moved to a place, we call it 58, Section 58. And that's where I spent most of my childhood and teenagehood. And I eventually ended up going to school, high school, in a different county. That is Nyeri County. And then how I ended up in Strathmore was because I came here to study accounting in Strathmore University. And then from there, I went to Lower Kabete campus. We used to call it Kabete Pesa, to distinguish it from the other Kabete, which was Upper Kabete, and we used to call it Kabete Ngombe. And then from there, I went into what we could call the work world or the corporate world. So I started working in a company, then eventually that company was called Diversity, and then eventually I came to Strathmore University. And then later on, I went to study for the priesthood in Rome and then in Spain. Eventually, I also worked in a vocational school that's run by the owners of Strathmore University, that is Strathmore Educational Trust, and it's called the Eastlands College of Technology. So I worked there for a while, and then eventually I went off to change my overalls or my dust coat and came back as a priest to work in Strathmore University. The first year, then I was asked to go and work in Kimlea Girls Technical Training College in Limuru, in Tigoni. And that's where I was before I was asked to come back to Strathmore University, where I am now.
Wonderful. Thank you for that bio. And it's very important for us to understand who you are and what your journey is, because today we'll be talking a lot about our spiritual well-being. And I believe you have a very big role in shaping how that is viewed by most of our constituents within the university. How long then have you held the position of university chaplain at Strathmore University?
Excellent question. I only became the chaplain of the university this year. I worked as a chaplain of other schools and faculties from 2022. So the first time I was here was in 2018. Worked for a year, then I came back in 2023. And then I was here from 2023, 2024, and then this year I was appointed the university chaplain after the former university chaplain was reassigned. He went to work in South Africa in the apostolates of Opus Dei. I am a priest of the prelature of Opus Dei, and it's Opus Dei that has been entrusted with the spiritual, let's say, care of the university. So the chaplaincy is entrusted to Opus Dei, and I am a priest of Opus Dei, so that's how I ended up in the university and also eventually appointed as a university chaplain. So it's this year. Thanks.
Now, something then we might want to know, given that we are within the Strathmore University family, what does your team look like in terms of the clergy?
In terms of the clergy who are working in the chaplaincy, we are 5 chaplains. In total, we are 5 chaplains. So I'm one of them. I'm the university chaplain. And then we have 4 other chaplains, starting with Father Bernard Nderito, who is the assistant university chaplain. He's also the chaplain of the School of Law, SLS, Strathmore Law School. You have Father Jude Karuhanga, who is also the chaplain of the School of Engineering and Computing, as well as Father Paul Mimbi, who is, of all the priests who are working in the chaplaincy, is the one who served the longest. For many years, he is also the chaplain of the university. He is the chaplain of SBS. And one who has joined us recently, he joined us this year, is called Father Manuel Alberto Grasa, who is now the chaplain of basically what Father Charles Mundia, who was the immediate former university chaplain, used to handle. So he has taken over his duties insofar as teaching and the schools also that he's helping at. So those are the 5. Father Bernard Nderito, Father Jude Karuhanga, Father Paul Mimbi, Father Manuel Alberto, and myself.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for explaining that, because it's important for us to know who we can turn to, especially when we are considering our spiritual well-being. And I'm going to ask you a little bit of a tough question here. I hope that you'll be able to answer it. Is we say that Strathmore University isn't a Catholic university, but we are inspired by Catholicism. Would you mind just explaining that in some way? And can I ask you, within the context of a very diverse student body and staff, we have Hindu, we have Muslim. So what, and maybe even atheist, by the way, what does it mean for us to be inspired?
Okay, so maybe beginning with that question of whether we are a Catholic university or not. As a matter of fact, we are not, because we are not owned by the hierarchy, that is the Catholic bishops. So as you know, in the Catholic Church, the head of a diocese is the bishop, and the head of the Universal Church is the Holy Father, who is also the Bishop of Rome. So at times what happens is they begin institutions to help them achieve the ends of the church, which ultimately is the salvation of souls and the glorification of God. And so part of that is, of course, the church itself has its own buildings and structures that will help give that glory to God through public worship. And in the case, of course, of the Catholic Church, that's through the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass principally, and other liturgical worship or liturgical practices. And then they also have institutions such as schools that impart education, and principally an education that is inspired by the Catholic faith. So, as well as other institutions like hospitals, feeding centers, and so on. So amongst them, amongst educational institutions, you have institutions of higher education. Of course, you also have tertiary institutions like vocational colleges and so on. Of course, primary schools, nursery schools, you name them. Orphanages, all sorts of things that the church does. And in fact, in this country, it's one of the biggest contributors to the education system as well as the hospital system. And then in this case, I think the easiest way to understand it is to think of Catholic University of East Africa, that is owned by what's called the AMESEA which is a conference of bishops of East and Central Africa. So Choir, we call it Choir, is owned by that bishops' conference. In the case of Strathmore University, it is not owned by the diocese or the Conference of Catholic Bishops, but it is owned by a trust that is called Strathmore Educational Trust or Strathmore Educational Registered Trustees. And so that is the fact that it can be verified and so on. So, and then we see it also in terms of its structure, that the university is run like any other private university. So it is, of course, it has its statutes and all that, and falls under the Kenyan laws as well. And so we have our Vice Chancellor, who is a layman. In the case of Choir, I think he is a priest now, if I remember correctly. But in Strathmore University, you'll never have a Vice Chancellor who's a priest. So it's a layman. And then basically the ones who will be accountable therefore for the running of the university, you have the management board as well as the university council and so on. And of course, ultimately the trustees. So it's a little bit like in corporate bodies, you have a board of directors, or you can say people who represent the shareholders. In this case, you can think of the shareholders as the trustees, and then the ones who represent them, the ones who form the university council, under which now you have, like in any company, you normally have a management team headed by the CEO or the managing director, whatever term they use. In this case, the equivalent will be the Vice Chancellor and his management team. And then you asked an important question, which is, what do you understand by inspiration? So we can say, yes, this way now maybe we can explain a little bit how the Catholic ethos come into play, because the inspiration behind the university is precisely Saint Josemaria, who is the founder of Opus Dei, and he is the inspiration behind the university. And being the founder of Opus Dei means he is the founder of an institution of the Catholic Church, and Opus Dei is basically an institution of the Catholic Church, and takes the teachings of Jesus Christ and the Catholic Church, and from that draws the values that inform our teaching, we can even say our culture in terms of the university. And then there are many things that we can speak about that come from that, So here we can speak about the values of Strathmore, which includes precisely that openness to everyone. If you look at the Strathmore logo, you have those three hearts. That, of course, a heart represents charity or love. And then at the time when it started, we had the three, you can say, social groups. You had the Africans, the Europeans, and the Asians. See, so of course now we can even speak about more diverse social groupings. Maybe if we look at it, you can say universally, you have more than the three, or you can divide it even further. But the idea is that we have to be open to all of them, and of course we welcome everyone to Strathmore, and we embrace them precisely with a Catholic spirit, which is to love as commanded by Christ. Our Lord tells us to love one another as he has loved us, or to love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, the highest of them is to love God. As he says, the first commandment is that love of God, and then, of course, love of neighbor. And so we love and respect the others. And of course, it is a two-way street. We want to teach them how to truly love, to be open to others, and to have a true communion of man, which means to have exchanges and friendships built, and people talking to one another, discussing all sorts of issues. So to have that openness. At the same time, we recognize, of course, that we are built on the values of the Catholic Church, and we are not shy about that. Therefore, we speak openly about our Catholic faith, and the Catholic faith precisely embraces everyone and invites them to discover Jesus Christ and His Church, and to embrace that faith willingly. I mean, it is something that they have to do because they want to. Wonderful. Thanks for that explanation. And I mean, many of us know, however, it's always good to be reminded about that, because spiritual well-being is such an important part of our journey in life. And we have then this, again, distinct opportunity to be part of an inspired community that is Strathmore University. So that's very important for us to know. And I want to get to the meat. We had a few questions come in over the last few weeks from students and staff. And so I just wanted to maybe bring some of them to your attention, and we see how to tackle them. And someone asks a very simple question. I hope it's simple. Maybe it's simple to me. However, what can you give as a starter pack for someone who is in a dire journey of discerning vocation? So, well, someone's entering the workforce, getting into their work life, and they want to be able to be well equipped spiritually. So what does that starter pack look like, Father Martin? So I suppose that we all have aspirations and dreams when we begin. And at the same time, we want to have a sense of direction in everything that we do. And this is where the question of vocation comes in. And I suspect the person asking the question is actually speaking about something that is existential. In other words, that's something that gives meaning to his or her life, her entire life, until the transition to the next, So what is the meaning of my life, So in that sense, it is indeed a deep question, and deep questions normally are simple questions, And so I'd say that one needs to pray, of course. If you're a Christian, you're well equipped because you have lots of resources to guide you. So pray and ask God, who is the one who gives a vocation. A vocation comes from the Latin word vocare, which is to call. So vocation means to call. So one wants to find the meaning of their life. And what am I called to? Am I called to a life of, for example, marriage? And if I'm called to a life of marriage, who am I called to marry? So you have to discern that. That is a big part of vocation, to discern, to find out. So one needs to, for that reason, I'd say one needs to really pray, ask God to give them light to see what God wants of them, and also the courage to take on what God shows them. Of course, part of that listening is also getting advice from people who walked that path that they are thinking about, and they can give them advice on. So I'd say speaking with someone who has walked the talk, doing some research, finding out about that particular way of life. Some people are called to a life of apostolic celibacy, whether, it's the priesthood, or it's to a religious life, or to simply giving oneself completely, living in the middle of the world like some people of Opus Dei do. So they give themselves completely to what God wants of them, and they are fully available for the apostolic needs of Opus Dei or a religious institution and so on. And there are many people who are like that. I mean, I've met some. The examples of our chaplains themselves. Maybe you might know, for example, I hope they don't get mad at me, but someone like Father Paul Mimbi was an engineer before he became a priest. Or Father Manuel Alberto was working as a doctor before he became a priest, a medical doctor. And Father Bernard Derito was a mechanical engineer. Or Father Jude was an electrical engineer. So they were formed in their professions, but then they discerned their vocation and were called to this sort of life, which is that of giving themselves as priests. You have others who, and the majority will be called to a life of marriage, in which case they have to discern well to find out their spouse and to understand what it means to get married as a vocation, because it is indeed a vocation, because it is a path to heaven. If it is lived out well, that means a marriage that is to one person exclusively, open to life, for life, and that it is indeed a wonderful path to heaven, because ultimately that's what they're called to lead each other and their children into heaven. So whatever the vocation God gives us, let us ask Him to show it to us and to give us the strength to do that. Then in that case, one needs to do the homework. One needs to do the hard work of searching, seeking counsel, so speaking with others who know about it or can guide you on it. And then once they have that moral certainty, then to step into it with confidence that God, who gives us the vocation, will give us the grace to live it out. And that's why we need to keep asking. We need to have recourse to, for example, in the Catholic faith, we speak about the sacraments. So the sacraments are means of grace that help us precisely fulfill our calling in life.
And I love the way you're explaining it. And so what's coming into my mind at this point, Father Martin, a few weeks ago at the business school, we had a talk by Father Manuel on the sanctification of work. And of course, even in the name of Opus Dei, there's this idea of work. And how do we now then link what you've just explained in terms of very specifically your calling, your vocation, to adhering to this very important principle that we espouse at Strathmore University and within the Opus Dei of sanctification of work? Because it's very important, isn't it?
Indeed, it is. If you think about what we've spoken about so far, we have said the greatest thing about our calling is precisely to do what God wants of us, so we ask Him. And then that love for the others, which is the other thing that God asks of us, to love one another as He has loved us, or to love neighbors ourselves. Now, to love God and to love others, then we have to do things well. In other words, if you really love someone, you give them the best. We, for instance, give people flowers to express our love. In the case of, something like Valentine's, people buy and give flowers. They don't give rocks, or, something less than a flower that expresses beauty and, has a good scent and all that. Then much more when it comes to giving God His due, which is ultimately everything. And that's why we have to do everything well. Here we can think about the story of Cain and Abel, and how God was pleased with the sacrifice of Abel. Why? Because he gave the best, He gave the best of his produce. And then in the case of we, as people who are working or, at home, everywhere, we have to give our best. And that means we have to, for example, seek to do our work well. St. Josemaria was big on that. He will insist, if you're going to offer up your work to God, you have to do it well. And that means to put in the human perfection. If you're a student, it means to study well, to understand your subject matter. And if you do that, you'll eventually do well in your exams, for instance. And not just your exams, because you've studied well, but also in your professional life. And there are many things that we can talk about in terms of the nitty-gritties. For example, the question of punctuality. To be in your workplace on time, to do your work well means to, as they say, cross the T's and dot the I's, taking care of small details, to deliver in terms of your deadlines, to put the finishing touches. For instance, if we speak a lot about the finishing when it comes to construction, or even when it comes to other technical jobs, if you're a mechanic, you work on that car or whatever machine you're working on, and you do it well, you make sure that everything functions well. But also your workspace has to be neat in the sense of you can find what you need. You have all the safety, you can say the safety measures in place. All those things matter. Why? Because you want to do it well for God, and not just for God, but for God's sake, for the others. So at home, you take care of your spouse, you take care of your children, you take care of your space, which is the home itself. It has to be warm and neat. It doesn't have to be luxurious because maybe you don't have all the money, but we all can make it neat, clean, and pass those values to the children and so on. So all that is not just in the office, but at home and also with your friends and so on. So you're doing precisely, that's what love is. Love is seeking the good of the other, So you want to give them the best. And in this case, that's what we do when we say we are sanctifying our work. We are making it, we're giving God the best. And also for the sake of the others, our fellow men, your colleagues at work, your team, and so on, that you are conscious that what you do has an impact on them and, can help them or can pull them down if you don't do it well.
Indeed. And thank you for that link and understanding in the sanctification of work. I just want to drill down on one of the things, one of the points that you gave as far as what our friend was asking in terms of vocation. You said, and getting advice rather, you said that it's important to be able to pinpoint where we can be mentored, who can mentor us, where we can get advice, and also taking the time to do research. Within the SU family, of course, you've explained the structure in terms of you and your team at SU, but maybe somebody is listening and saying, so where do I go? Is there an office? Is there a time I can go knock on the door and say, I want to be mentored. I want to be given the opportunity to work with someone who has done this before. What does that look like, Father Martin? Because we might have people who really do want to do the best. They want to give their best, but they perhaps for one reason or the other don't even know where to walk into when they are on campus. What would that look like, Father Martin?
Great. So, as chaplains, we try and avail ourselves to our community, and we are available, you can even say 24/7 in terms of the priest, At times, what we try and do is to make it as practical as possible. So we avail ourselves from 7 in the morning. We are present in the chapel, So for now, we are having some works going on in our main chapel. So we are now in SBS most of the time, but we also in our offices. So you'll always find someone, and we'll be there until 7 p.m. There is a lunch break where, we go and feed our bodies. So we just don't take care of our soul, but our bodies as well. Some of us are like walking proof of that. And then what we do is we are available not only. So what we try and do, for instance, we even try and accommodate people who don't who want to have some level of anonymity because maybe they are shy, or so we have what's called a confessional, and in the confessional the person can sit on the other side and we don't see them, but we can hear them, and then they can ask their questions and so on. Otherwise, they can come to the office if we're available. We are normally, the offices, the doors are open. We have also a timetable that you can find in the website of strathmore.edu /chaplaincy. We have resources there, and one of them are the chaplains, and there you have the timetable of the chaplains. So you can always get to us through them, or our chaplaincy assistants who are a phone call away from us, or they know where we are in a particular moment and who is available and so on. So we are, and then of course you can just stop us, in the streets of Strathmore and say, "Hey, Father, how are you? Could we talk? Or, can I ask you something?" So feel very free to stop a priest. Don't be shy. You'll not be judged or deemed, uncouth, whatever. No, just feel very free, and we are open to everyone.
Yes. Thank you so much, Father Martin. That's important for us to know, so we never feel lost, especially with how fast the world is moving and the number of things we have to do, both as staff and as students. And we, switching gears, we have a related topic that obviously is very important to many, many people and also confusing, is that of mental health. And one of the questions that was shared prior to this podcast is, how does the chaplaincy support staff, and in parentheses I'll add students, with mental health issues? Of course, it's so broad, but maybe we can tie it back to work, your calling, and also how we are able to address that through the principles of the Opus Dei. What does that look like nowadays, Father Martin? Given that you've been in this area, in this space for quite some time, how has that evolved? How are we addressing it? How can we help each other?
Okay, so as you say, mental health is such a broad area. And of course, as the chaplains or chaplaincy, we try and contribute to a healthy atmosphere in terms of the workspace, and even more importantly, I'd say the home space, if you can call it that way, because you'll notice that everything begins in the home. So where someone has been brought up, and also you can say the space that they're now dwelling in. So it can be a place that helps them to flourish, or it can be something that impacts them negatively. So in many ways, we want to encourage people to have a healthy home space by taking care of issues like their home environment in terms of their marriage, if at all they're married. If they're not and they're discerning, how they take care of that as well, how they take care of basically the relationships with the others. So one of the things that is, and our mental health experts can attest to this, that is so important in terms of mental health are relationships. I remember a couple of years back, even before I became a priest, meeting a couple who had come over from Switzerland, and they were telling us they came, actually it was the husband, the wife, and their 3 kids, and we spent time with them. At the time I was working in Eastlands College of Technology, so we visited many of the poor areas of Eastlands, like Mukuru, the slums, and so on. Of course, they were impacted, and at some point we had a big get-together with some of the kids who come over to Eastlands College, plus many others, the staff and basically staff and students. And they were asking all sorts of questions. And I remember one of the questions that stuck with me was precisely, given the fact that they were from a rich country at the time, I remember they were saying that half of the population there are millionaires. And I was thinking, my goodness, in our case, more than half actually live below the poverty rate. There, half are millionaires, not even. But then they were telling us how they have big problems, and the problems are related to mental health. Lots of suicidal behavior, and so people taking their own lives, and brokenness. Of course, we also have brokenness in our country. Even suicide is becoming a problem. So we asked them, because the husband was, I think, a psychiatrist and the wife was a psychologist, or vice versa. I don't remember that now. But they said the most important thing because someone actually asked directly, how do we avoid falling into a depression? Well, because I'd spoken also about that. And they were saying, okay, the biggest factors are relationships. And in that case, the relationship in the family and the relationship with God. So in that sense, I think from that perspective, those are the things we want to have the greatest impact in: the relationship with God and the relationship with the others, in this case, the families, and friends, so the kind of friends that you have as well impacts a lot on your mental health. And of course, you want to have friends who help you grow, and who are a support also in terms of the difficulties that we go through life, which are a fact of life. I think we also have to come to that realization that whether we want it or not, difficulties will be there in life, and then the question is how to deal with that.
And thank you for that. And what's going through my mind right now is young people. I really don't like the term Gen Z, but it's what we know. It's what people will understand in terms of, in parentheses, youth. There's a question here from somebody who is asking, and I hope it's related to what we're saying, is, they have a 17-year-old nephew who lives with them in their home. They are practicing Catholics, and they do their best to do the things that are they're called to do, including services, praying, catechism. But this young fellow does not necessarily want to be participating in that. And so we know from research, we know from the stories we're hearing about, from even the one you just relayed to us, younger people are disenchanted and not really interested in the way of religion. I'm not going to say the way of Christ, because I don't know. Some people may be very much in love with Christ, but they don't go to church, or they don't feel welcome in a certain area. So my question here then will be, how do we speak to our youth who are at this moment more prone to the mental health issues that are prevailing in the world, not just in Kenya? We have obviously a much bigger ratio of younger people at Strathmore University because we are a higher learning education. From your perspective as a chaplain, how do we help someone who has kids who don't seem interested?
I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is how to educate people in freedom, which is a big part actually of real education. Real education should educate us in the proper use of our freedom, because as human beings, we are endowed with an intellect and a will, our highest faculties of the soul. And we also have, of course, our animal side of things, So Aristotle famously defined man as a rational animal. So we have indeed our rational appetites, we can call them, or in this case, the intellect and the will, which is the greatest of the gifts that we have, that we are thinking beings. And not only thinking beings, but we are thinking and loving beings. We can love. And then at the same time, we recognize that we have our animal appetites. So our passions, our joys, our sorrows, our anger, and all those we have to integrate into a well-functioning rational animal that we are. And for that reason, I think the battle is always to align our what you can call our animal appetites to our rational appetites, to subject them, because keep in mind, as thinking, loving beings, we ought to move in a way that we are a unit, so we are not conflicted. The inner conflict is what becomes very problematic. And so I'll encourage parents as well as the youngsters. First, for the parents to remember that once we were youngsters, we were the Gen Zs at the time, or we were the teenagers at the time, and we had our own battles. So in that sense, to try and understand them from that perspective, hey, how will I have, or how did I do it at the time, and okay, also recognizing that the times are different. So how can I take that into account and then help this son or daughter of mine in their circumstances? So for instance, that we should not force them to pray, or to, forcing them doesn't work. At a certain age, we have to let them be and learn how to use their freedom well. So hopefully they recognize what is good, what is evil, and so on, and strive to follow what is good and so on. But to let them be. You might remember, I don't know if you remember the story of St. Augustine. He was crazy. He was a wild kid, let's put it that way, And at some point, the mother really was desperate, didn't know what to do, went to, most probably, Ambrose or another bishop, who told him, don't worry, let him be. And a child of the tears like this will never be lost. And eventually, St. Augustine discovered the truth that he has been searching for. The places he had been searching were the wrong places for his happiness, until he discovered God. And so that has to come from someone who honestly is searching. So we can encourage them, of course, to search for the truth and to live by the truth, to let that truth shape them ultimately. And at the same time, to give them that space, especially when they leave the home. Of course, we keep tabs with them, we call them up, we find out how things are going, we visit them and all that. At the same time, being careful not to impose ourselves on them. So it is sort of a guided freedom, but from afar. And then we still, as parents, especially the parents who are worried about their children when they leave the nest, when they leave home and go to live on their own and so on. Well, your job is not yet over, because you can still pray for them, and you should pray for them. As they say, pray them into heaven, Of course, showing them the affection and always affection or love with truth, always with truth. we should never compromise truth in the name of love, because that is not loving. That is a lie, not living by a lie. So truth and love. And that means, and I remember one of the great advice that was given by some parents was like, you love them. Whatever they do, if they put their foot into it, love them. And loving means at times has to be a tough love, at times has to be expressed in words, at times it's in silence, and so on. So it's really a question of an education of freedom.
Start to think about love. You've mentioned it quite a number of times, and it's also something that's a prevailing area at Strathmore University. One time I was just speaking very randomly with Dr. George Jenga, and he asked me how business was going, and I said, in Swahili, tunajaribu tu, we are trying. And he looked at me and says, love your customer. And it's always been with me. It was maybe about a year ago, but it's been with me because loving the person who you're dealing with, loving the environment is very important if you want to have the disposition to do the good work that we are called to do, or to actually be able to go through life's challenges. So there's a question here I'm going to ask you and then link it to love. One person here is saying, where is God when I'm struggling with life? When I'm wondering about school fees, when I'm coming, where will it come from? When I'm too sick to work. So Father Martin, how can I maintain a disposition of love, an attitude of love, when it is so hard, when the world seems to be coming at me from every direction? How do I remain in love and operate from a point of departure of love? How do I do that?
Yeah, great question. And that's a tough question. At the same time, I think it's good to start with maybe some sort of working definition here. What is love? Love, according to the great minds, someone like Thomas Aquinas says, love is seeking the good of the other. So it's not focused on me. It's not a sort of a turning into oneself, but an opening oneself to the other. And then that's how we discover our happiness, because we are not made just for ourselves. So this is the interesting logic of love. The more I love the others, the more I feel loved. We are made precisely for love. At the same time, I think it's important to remember that, as we mentioned, being rational creatures, we have an intellect. We are supposed to be these thinking beings. And so one of the dangers is, of course, we can be brought up in a system where we are taught how to emote rather than to think. And so everything is based on our feelings. And I think it's an important thing to go above that, to remember that, hey, what needs to take the lead here is my rationality. And I need to think and to see the reality around me. Then another good definition of love is giving one's life for the sake of the beloved. So again, you can see love is it's about giving. And of course, the greatest example of that is what we're about to celebrate now. Next week, we celebrate Easter. But of course, before Easter comes the cross. And as our Lord Jesus Christ said, greater love has no man than to lay down his life for the sake of his friends. And he says, you are my friends if you do what I command you. Now, with all that said, there is a question of evil. And this is one of the biggest obstacle to people seeing God. They ask, how can God exist or even be present in my life when I see evil around me or all these terrible things going on? Where is he? Is he not omnipotent? Is he not omniscient? Doesn't he know everything? Yeah. And so the question is, how do you explain that evil in the world? And I think it's good to remember that first and foremost, God is not the author of evil, and what we understand as evil, I think, was best described by St. Augustine, who says that evil really is a deprivation. It is, you can say, a deprivation of a due good. So, for instance, we used to be jazzed or amused by the three-legged goat, So actually, we can speak about a physical evil because it's supposed to be a four-legged goat. So it's missing one leg, which is due to make it a proper goat, we can say. Okay, so we can call that a physical evil. But then what is more disturbing is what we call the moral evil, So there is a lack of a due good in certain things that we do, and we notice that, and it pains us, what you can call the moral evil. And then the question is, why does God then permit it? Because why can't he just stop it and everything is, as they say, honky-dory, everything is sunshine and butterflies, and there is no more evil, we'll be happy. Actually, there is a place like that, and that's heaven. Unfortunately, it is not here now, because one day, God willing, if we are faithful to God and to his commands, we shall get there. But for now, we have to contend with the reality which is around us. And again, this is where now we have to go back to the intellect and to see the truth around us. That yes, there is evil, and the question is, how do we face it? Because whether we like it or not, it will be there. And the question is, how will I face it? And maybe even a previous question to that is, why does it exist in the first place? And I think a simple question is, we can speak of free will. So man has been created with a free will, allowing us to choose between good and evil. And this freedom is essentially for choosing good and choosing genuine virtue and love, but also is open to the opposite, the possibility of sin and evil. And unfortunately, man failed, and through choosing evil, evil and death entered into the world. And we can see that in us, and we can see that around us, man making bad choices, when someone chooses to steal, when someone chooses to kill, or, that not only affects him, affects others as well. It affects, if someone, for instance, gambles away, it not only affects his bank account, but affects his family, the spouse, the children, and so on. And that's what happens with evil. When people, now there's a big, of course, has been for quite a while now, the question of corruption in this country. People steal, and that affects the citizens. We end up paying higher taxes or whatever to make up for such things, and so on. And then when it comes closer home, it's when now it hits us in terms of like what the person was asking. Maybe my parents can't pay the fees, and so on and so forth. So and then it gets even more interesting when the people who are doing those evils seem to be the ones prospering. The thieves and the maybe people who've done, and it is true, they seem, and I think that's a good word, they seem to do good, because justice is a reality, and it will be that justice will be rendered here, or happens in many cases in the world to come, because we see that at times justice is not rendered here. And so the idea is to see, and at times it's difficult to see the good that comes out of it, because actually there is a greater good that God draws out of it. And at times it is hard to see it, especially because when you're in the thick of war or battle, it's hard to see clearly, are we winning here, or, and perhaps it looks like you're losing, and that's because you don't have the full picture. Maybe the one who has the bigger picture is the general, the one who has command of the army and so on. But if you are right there in the middle of the thing, it looks like, I'm not making any progress here. This doesn't make any sense, and so on. And so my advice is, draw inspiration from those of us, or the rest of, if you look at the rest of mankind, who are the ones who triumphed over evil? We call them the saints. They were not spared evil, and yet they are the friends of God. And they faced that evil and they triumphed, as opposed to the ones who are even instruments of that evil, who didn't triumph. In fact, they died miserable deaths and so on and so forth. The people who steal now, well, the reality is, it doesn't matter how much you steal, you'll have to render justice. If you don't render that justice here, in the next world for sure, because God is justice. But at the same time, the question is, how am I going to face that cross? How am I going to trust God in that difficulty? And I think that's a good word to use. Trust God. Have faith in God that He will draw this good out of that evil that is present in your life now. And there'll be a time, there'll be a resurrection, including when you look at the story of the two thieves, one on the right of Christ and the other on the left. All of them were in pain and in suffering and so on. One of them mocked God, the other one asked for God's mercy. And of course, the one who asked for God's mercy is the one who ended up in a place where there's no more pain, suffering, etc. In the Catholic tradition, we consider him a saint, in fact. But the other one was condemned because he mocked God, and he didn't seek His mercy, and so on. So how do we face that suffering? By uniting it to the suffering of Christ, to realize that, Christ suffers with us. He suffers on the cross for our redemption. In fact, that's the greatest form of evil that was committed against God, killing God on the cross. And out of that has arisen the greatest good for man, for the person who asked the question, for me, for you, which is our redemption, the possibility now that we have of going to heaven that didn't exist before. The only way was damnation, And so the solution is Christ and the cross. And to find meaning in that suffering, I think the greatest answer is basically Jesus Christ and His cross.
Mm-hmm. And Father Martin, as we begin to wrap up, we've been talking for an hour. I do wish we could talk for much longer, and maybe we can turn this into a fireside chat one time for the benefit of the listeners and for the community at large. If you were to summarize our conversation with the idea of being the salt of the earth, we spoke about this before, you and I. What are some points that people who are listening, they're Gen Z, they are millennials, they're parents, they are workers, and we look at this big bad world, but we know deep down in our hearts that if we only rely on God, if we're able to call on Jesus, if we're able to do the next right thing, we'll be fine. How would you summarize it as Father Martin to remaining the salt of the earth despite being in this big bad world? What are the take-home points for somebody who's listening and just wants to be able to have those written somewhere? for themselves.
Yes, great. So maybe here we are thinking about the words of our Lord, that you are the salt of the earth, and that salt that has lost its saltiness, is no good. It's only good to be thrown out. And then how do we therefore remain salty or without saltiness? And in the same vein, he also says that you're also the light of the world, and that light has to shine. And here we can think about our streets in Nairobi and so on. At times, there's a lack of light, and what happens is that we fear, and we fear walking into a hole or some being attacked by an animal or some thug or something. So, that's the sort of world that we are living in. It's covered in darkness, but then the great light is Christ. And he declares himself to be that light that has come into the world to dispel that darkness. And so basically for us to retain our saltiness and for us to be that light, we have to be plugged into Christ. That's what I'll say. So plug yourself into Christ. What does that look like? Well, it's not simply a thing of feelings, but it's much deeper. And it's, as we said, using our higher faculties of the reason and will. Faith precisely helps us, illumines our intellect, and gives us these truths. And that's why it's important for us, and this will be sort of the parting shot, to get to know our faith. To know Christ means to read about him and to deal with him, to know him like the way you deal with a friend. How do people get to know each other? Well, you not only check out the profile of someone in LinkedIn or Facebook, whatever, but ultimately you want to meet them. And of course, here we can think about even relationships. It's not enough to be friends on Facebook or whatever, but to actually meet and to go out, maybe on a date, and to get to know each other. So the same thing with Christ, even more, to get to know him. And for that, I'd say there are many resources to get to know Christ. I'd say chiefly sacred scripture and the catechism of the Catholic Church. It's an important resource. Or even if it's too daunting or too big, there are other smaller catechisms that can help, and very short and precise, like the Catechism of Pius X. Okay, so that way we get to know Christ, because you cannot love someone that you do not know, and so love follows that knowledge, and the more you get to know someone, the more you can love them. And that's why I think it's always important to keep learning, to keep opening your intellect to the truth and letting that truth shape your love for God. And I'd say that's the next thing. And how do we love God? Well, so in the Catholic Church, of course, we speak about the sacraments. So the holy sacrifice of the Mass, if someone hasn't been baptized, and we facilitate that also in the university. Baptism, First Holy Communion, confirmation. If someone has not done their marriage properly, they need to regularize their marriage. So the sacrament of matrimony and so on. So, and then of course, part of that knowing and loving is precisely prayer. That every day, set time aside to pray. Every day I say I'll pray, and I'll spend some 10 minutes, 15 minutes alone with God, as our Lord says in the Gospel of Matthew. He speaks about the Beatitudes in chapter 5, then chapter 6, chapter 7 goes on to speak about the importance of praying. But spend time with God in prayer. Then finally, I'd say that love for God has to be made manifest also in the love for others, and also in a properly ordered love of self. What do I mean by love of self? Hating sin, which is really the true evil. Loving virtue. In other words, to love what Christ loves and to hate what Christ hates. And he hates it because it is going to destroy us. Just like a father will hate, an illness that is going to destroy the son or the daughter. So that's why you take the kid to hospital. And the kid at times may not understand. It's like, gosh, Dad, do something about this horrible dentist. But okay, precisely that's what we are doing here. They have to pull out that bad tooth or whatever. So that love for self means that, not getting rid of sin in our lives and embracing virtue. And then that way we're able to love the others. And to love the others means to seek their good, to be, I'd say we can summarize that as being a true friend. So the value of friendship, that always seeks the good of the other. So I'd say to summarize all that is what our Lord tells us. If you want to be that salt, well, then you have to love God. That will always ensure that we are salty as well as neighbor for God's sake. And that will help us through any situation.
Wonderful, wonderful, a wonderful summary. Before I let you go, Father Martin, next week is an important week in the Christian community. What does that look like at SU in terms of the services and the celebrations that we'll be having next week?
Right. So as you know, in Strathmore University, we, I don't know if it's unfortunately or fortunately, we take an Easter break. So I suppose it's fortunately because then we can spend time with God and our families wherever we are. So it's a great time to, I think, to be united as family and friends and so on. And then in terms of the ceremonies, for that reason, then we don't have the Easter ceremonies in the university. So what happens is people go for them in their different parishes and Christian communities. So what does it look like? Well, on Thursday is a great day, a big day for especially the Catholic Church, because it is a day in which Christ institutes the priesthood and the Eucharist. So the Last Supper. And then for that reason, people are encouraged, of course, to assist at Mass. And normally you have what's called the Maundy Thursday. Actually, it's called Maundy. That word, Maundy, comes from the Latin word mandatum, which is a commandment, no? And that is the time that Christ gives precisely the commandment to love. No mandatum, no mandatum. How does he say it? A new commandment I give you. I mandate you, to love one another. It's a strange thing. How can you be commanded to love? So precisely that you love one another even as I have loved you. So that is Holy Thursday. Then Good Friday, of course, we have the main, or the high point is the crucifixion of Christ. So it all starts on Thursday evening, the Last Supper, until the crucifixion of Christ and his burial in the sepulchre. And that's why we try and go for Mass on Saturdays. on Holy Thursday. Good Friday, there's no Mass. You have what's called the Good Friday service. Precisely, you can say the Mass is precisely what is instituted on Thursday and consummated on Friday. That's the whole Mass. Well, plus also the resurrection, of course. So in the Mass, that's what the Holy Mass is. The Holy Sacrifice of the Mass is precisely that event, starting on Holy Thursday into Good Friday. And of course, the night of nights, what's called the Vigil of Vigils, the mother of all vigils, which is Holy Saturday, well, the Easter Vigil rather. So Holy Saturday, there's no Mass because Christ is in the tomb. And then the big day, which is Sunday, Easter Sunday, which is, of course, preceded by the Vigil. The Vigil is like now, the greatest of them all. And of course, Easter now is what gives rise to Sunday. Why do we as Christians celebrate Sunday and not Saturday as the day of the Lord? Because precisely it is the day of the resurrection. It is the day of the new creation. It is the day that Jesus Christ triumphantly overcame sin and death, speaking of sin and death. So that is the answer precisely to the question of evil.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Father Martin. And this has been a delightful conversation. Again, I wish we could have it even longer, and hopefully Strathmore University Wellness will be guiding us on that and seeing whether we could have even a fireside chat and have more people in the room to be able to hear what you're saying, what you're sharing with us. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I think for me, my take-home point, one just major theme is love. And if we can start from there, we're moving in the right direction, regardless of anything that's happening to us, with us, around us. If we work with love, then we have the right fuel within us. Yes. I'll just remind those who are listening that you can find all information on the website for the chaplaincy. It's www.strathmore.edu/chaplains/. So if anyone is looking for information on the timings of the chaplaincy, the contact information, also where they are in the STC office on the second floor, you can go onto the website. And as Father Martin, you've said, when we see you, we stop you and say, hi, can we have a chat?
Yes, right. That's very right. And it doesn't matter, at times we are rushing somewhere, but we always have time to stop and listen to those who want to speak with us. Yeah, and indeed it has been a joy talking with you. And I'd like to wish everyone a happy Easter as we go into Holy Week, and that we benefit from this sort of programs and the services that we avail in the chaplaincy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Father Martin, and to everyone.
All right, you too.